The next, please. Just some more pictures. Next one, please. The people had ripped down the war memorials. They had these big stars on top of the buildings. They ripped those down. They cut holes into flags because the flags had the hammer and sickle. So people took scissors to their flags and cut a hole in the center. And they burnt and destroyed all communist books and literature. Prisons were stormed and prisoners were released and armed, because once they stormed the prisons, they had guns and weapons. The soldiers, the Hungarian soldiers, also gave people, the revolutionary fighters, guns to fight with. So the weapons were confiscated from the AVO. The freedom fighters made Molotov cocktails and threw them at Russian tanks. And there was fighting not only in Budapest, but all through the countryside. They were throwing tanks and Russian vehicles into the Danube. I mean, there was horrific fighting going on. Next, please. Here we go with the burning of the flags. Next one, please. These were the Czepel factory workers that I spoke about. It took 300 of those trucks to bring the statue down, just so they could see it. And they came from the heartland of the workers, Czepel. They were the communists, and they rose up against communism. Everybody rose up against communism. Okay, next one. Here we go. They had the, what they did is in the city, the children and some of the men would douse the streets with slippery substances like sudsy water and oil. And when the Russian tanks would go between the streets, the cobbled streets, it would slip and slide. They wouldn't get any traction. And the tanks would slide against the building in a corner. And once they were in there, people would throw Molotov cocktails, and children too. They would throw it into the tanks. And here is one tank that was captured. Next one here. Children, sometimes 10, 11, 12-year-old children were part of the skirmish here. They would bring objects to barricade the street so the Russian tanks could not pass by. Children in the streets would douse the streets with slippery substances and use Molotov cocktails. Girls, women, young children, Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, young children were involved in the revolution. Many children were killed. So all over the country, the revolutionaries were at war. There was a general strike. Nobody wanted to go back to work. They refused to go back to work. So the prime minister said, we're going to increase the wages. We're going to make it affordable for people to eat. But a little too late, the workers refused to go back. They didn't believe empty promises anymore. Prime Minister Nagy agreed that he was going to abolish the Secret Service police. And the cardinal was released from jail. Next one, please. Oh, sorry, okay, go back here. The whole country was basically overjoyed. And there was like about 4 or 5 days of peace. They thought that the Russians went back, all the tanks retreated, the troops went back, and they thought, hey, we won the war. But that was not the case, and I'll tell you in a little minute. I'm going to fast forward this a little bit forward because my father, at this time, he was a revolutionary fighter. He wasn't always a revolutionary fighter. My father was a colonel before, and he was delisted in 1954 because there was a cutback. And I don't know why he was delisted. It might be for many reasons. Perhaps there wasn't any money left over to run the military, or perhaps Russia felt that Hungary didn't need the strong military. But my father was very open, and he talked a lot, and maybe his mouth got him into trouble. I don't know. I went back to the military museum and the archives, and they sent me all his documents and all his records. So I do know that in 1950, he was the instructor of the Defense Academy. In 52, he was appointed commander of the 62nd Airborne Regiment. In 53, he was the right-hand man of the regimental commander with the 47th Airborne Regiment. And then in 54, he was delisted. So something is not quite right there. I have a cousin in Hungary who works for the military, and he went over the records with me. He says, something, it's still a mystery. Unfortunately, pardon me?
Under the table.
I don't know what happened. Unfortunately, Dad has passed away, and I don't know the details. It never occurred to me to ask him when I was young. I didn't ask a lot of questions when I was young. I wanted to get assimilated, and it wasn't my priority to know about the revolution or my ancestry, and unfortunately took the passing away of both of my parents, my mother 3 years ago, my dad before that, to make me really sick. You know, there's something in the past, you need to revisit it, and you have to pass on this legacy to your children and grandchildren. My father, he took part in many of these demonstrations. My mother always feared for his involvement. She didn't want him to go anywhere. Father was an intellectual man. He was very grumpy, and he had a short temper, and he could size up a situation in a nanosecond and be ready for anything. And I think Father was a bit paranoid too. A lot of people were paranoid back then, rightfully so. Mother tried to balance his troubled mind. She wasn't very successful. But Father, in spite of his shortcomings, had a huge and enormous heart. He always gave of himself to people. When anyone was in trouble, he was always there. And he gave of himself during the revolution where he was captured. He even wanted to lay down his life if he had to. He was captured, he was sentenced, he was put into prison. He was supposed to be hanged. And before hanging, he escaped. It's going to be in the book, but I'm not going to talk about that. And usually, they would hang you from the bridge. So it was pretty brutal back then. He was of humble beginnings, as most of our ancestors were at one time, humble beginnings. He was the son of a blacksmith. He had the gift of gab, and he liked to have the audience. He loved history, he loved politics, he loved debates, and he had a lot of fire in his belly. So let me just tell you that on the 4th of, next slide. So there was peace for about 4 or 5 days. However, on November the 4th, at 4 a.m. in the morning, when most people slept, Russia decides to send in the Russian troops. But they weren't ordinary Russian troops, because the Russian troops bonded with the Hungarians. They wouldn't kill them. So Russia enlisted the help of the Mongolians, and they sent them into Hungary to plow through the streets. So at 4 o'clock in the morning, I don't have to paint a picture what happened. It was brutal. The city was surrounded and captured. In the meantime, when this was taking place, war breaks out in the Middle East over the Suez Canal crisis, and it diverted the attention from Hungary to another location. While the revolution was building, Hungary was encouraged by the world, by the people with free nations, and by the United States. Don't worry, we're behind you. We're behind you, we're behind you, we're behind you. Just keep doing what you're doing, we're behind you. But then, as the Middle East crisis happened, Egypt wanted to nationalize its Suez Canal, and other countries thought, no, we're not going to do that way. So Britain and France bombed Egypt, and they sent their land forces into that area, leaving Hungary abandoned. Cardinal Mindszenty was arrested again, the Catholic cardinal, and he took up asylum, refuge in the U.S. Embassy until much, much later on, where he served his lifetime there. Naturally, the AVO secret police was back. The UN and the U.S. condemned the aggression of England, France, and Israel. UN sent peacekeeping troops into Egypt, even though Hungary asked for help. And even though America and the rest of the world heard Hungary's call for help, only the Red Cross help was given, and Hungary was on its own. Next slide, Vivian. Let me see where I have my notes here. These were pictures of the Hungarian troops, the Mongolian troops. Next one. I seem to have misplaced my card. It made it pretty big all over the globe. Time magazine. When I wrote my book, I had to do a great amount of research for the book, and I went into a lot of the archives from different papers all over the world. New York Times is a great source, and I was able to get a lot of information there. Next, please. Just some pictures of the aftermath of the fighting. It lasted until about the end of November, and it trickled down into a little bit until the 17th of January. But there wasn't that much fighting in January. Next one, please. These are just some candid shots of what happened. Next. If you want me to leave the slide on, just let me know. Here you could see the flag with the hole in the middle. It's kind of symbolic when you see this gaping hole. Imagine a hole in your flag, what that means. Next one. There's some really gruesome pictures. I didn't put them in my slide. Next one. The street was in a rubble. After Second World War, and then 56, 57. How many times can you rebuild a nation? Think of it in your terms. We had 9/11, and that impacted us so much. But when you have a whole city, a whole country, and you have to rebuild after wars, after wars, after wars, it takes a dent out of one's will. But next one. Here, some of the Russian soldiers that they bonded with, the resistance fighters actually helped them. It's not the fighters that they were against, it's what it stood for. They wanted their independence and the freedom back. Next one here. Okay. This is very poignant. A soldier and his wife or mother going back at the end of the day of heavy fighting and shelling. Heads down. They had a system. Farmers and peasants would bring in their food to the people that worked in the city because food was not obtained. And they had an honorary system of donation, and people had these boxes all throughout the city. It was not guarded. Nobody took a dime. Nobody took any money at all. And people gave whatever they could for the cause to help other people. Would we be able to do that and leave money out in public like that? Here we go. Public cemeteries in the middle of the street. I mean, bodies were riddled. I heard there are different conflicting numbers. I hear of 3,000 civilians being killed. It went up as 5,000 and 6,000. I heard of 750,000 Russian soldiers that died in the war. A lot of people died. And think of that mother over there in terms of what we have today, our soldiers coming back from the war. How heart-wrenching it is to be sitting there. Next one, baby. Well, they called it the brain drain. A lot of people, they were mostly young people that left during the revolution. And while there were still porous borders and people could escape, they left anywhere we could. Some later, as you could see in November. When we left, we didn't have snow. The soil was pretty sticky and tacky, and it was cold. We had an unseasonably warm October, and it was very, very warm. People just had light jackets. I remember being at a train station similar to the one at the bottom. Next one. And then in other areas, depending on where you lived in Hungary, people escaped wherever they could. Sometimes they would even walk through frozen water and carry children over their heads just to make it through to go into Austria. Here, we arrived in Canada in '56, similar to this shot over here. The United States received 40,000 people when it came in. 200,000 people left. Think of what it means on the drain, the dent on a country. socially, economically, the intellectual resources, the labor force. Think of the message it sends to the rest of the world. If you compare it to United States here, per capita ratio, it is equivalent to the state of Massachusetts, all of Massachusetts, packing up, abandoning their homes, and leaving United States forever. That's how much 200,000 represented at that time with the population ratio. But in today's term, that's what it would be equivalent to. I think that's about it for my slide presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed giving it to you. You've been a captive audience. Thank you for listening.